host, Kylie Dixon, and tonight we'll be having a very special guest, my boyfriend, Chris Ortega. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you? Hello, everyone.
So, we are going to be getting into the discussion of the film American Sniper, starring Bradley Cooper.
Yes.
So just off the bat, what were some of your likes and dislikes?
So, right off the bat, my mother was in the Army for 5 years. And growing up as a kid, we liked to watch war movies such as American Sniper. So one thing I really appreciated was the accurate military culture and mannerisms, as well as I believe it had a good action to seriousness ratio. What about you?
I agree, and I actually put some of those things, and thank you for that very personal touch about your mother. I think that's it's very insightful.
Thank you.
So I also put that I liked the realistic display of PTSD. I think that was important, and I think that they did a very good job at addressing that. And I also put that there was a good balance between the action and the storyline. I liked how it went back and forth from showing him overseas and fighting to him being home with his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Some of my dislikes, did you get to your dislikes?
I did not, but you can go first.
Okay, I will go first. So there are no mentions before or during or after the film on like resources for PTSD or mental health problems. So that was something that maybe isn't like a huge dislike, but like just something that I had a little bit of a gripe with. I wish maybe they would have put some sort of hotline or website, something.
I agree.
Reach out
I
to.
agree.
And then also it does not pass the Bechdel test. It's pretty shocking that it did not pass that. So
Yes.
that was one of my dislikes. So.
I agree with several of yours. I also didn't like that there was a lack of PTSD resources or mental health resources.
All right, so let's get into the target audience. I know we talked about this briefly when we watched it. There were some things that were like pretty obvious about who they were trying to target. So I have written down this was a very conservative movie. It definitely appealed to conservatives. Also, people who like action movies, I think just baseline. There's some action in there. People considering joining the military, could be for them. Spouses and relatives of veterans or active military members.
Yes.
And then also, this might be a stretch, but we also talk about this, possibly people who also suffer from mental health issues. And that just ties back into my dislike of it not really having resources, that if people like that are watching it, it could definitely be like a trigger.
Right.
Sure. So
Right.
I definitely think it's important to have those resources out there.
I agree with you there. I think it could potentially sort of resurface some of the trauma that you've also experienced and then kind of leave you high and dry.
All right, so moving on to some of the themes and ideas. There is pretty obviously savior complex theme, which ties into also the heroism. And then there's a lot of individualism. So the movie is entirely focused on Chris Kyle. We do see his wife and his brother and friends of his in the military, but it's always pretty much centered around him. So lots of individualism. Tying back into the mention of the Bechdel test, there are definitely gender roles. Gender definitely plays a huge part in this movie. So like his wife stays home, and it's pretty implied that she doesn't have a job. She doesn't work. We pretty much only see her at home or in the hospital for an ultrasound or whatever. So lots of gender roles there. And then there's also this theme of selfish versus like selflessness. So I think they kind of paint his wife out to be kind of selfish, like his PTSD is a burden for her. It's kind of how they paint it out to be. And then there's obviously the selflessness with him, back to the aforementioned hero complex, savior complex. There's a lot of selflessness on his part. Did you have any themes or ideas to add to that? Are there any like overarching themes that you saw?
I agree with all of those. I was gonna make one point about your first point, the savior complex. In the movie, Chris Kyle actually is asked by a fellow Navy SEAL if he has a savior complex.
I thought that was very interesting that they
Yes.
just addressed that head on.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's interesting how it ties in throughout the whole movie. You know, even when he's not deployed, or after his career when he's a veteran, he takes on this own like therapy form where he takes out other veterans
Right.
to go shoot at a range. So I think his savior complex like continues throughout the movie, even when it's not necessarily military related. So this is a pretty interesting question. How do you think this movie would be perceived outside of the U.S.?
I don't think it's perceived well. I would imagine it's a pretty typical, hey, we're Americans, we're a powerhouse of the world.
It's definitely very America-centered.
Yes.
It's definitely very centered on American values.
Yeah.
And even, you know, outside of the military, when they're back home and they're in the backyard and they've got their friends and family over and they're doing like a cookout, and I assume having like hot dogs and hamburgers.
Right.
It's just very much so like typical American dream, white picket fence.
Yes.
So yes, definitely very American-centered. And something interesting, an interesting fact about this movie is that it was actually banned from being screened in Iraq.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was. So some places it sparked a lot of controversy. So yeah, no, I definitely got most of its revenue in the U.S. It was.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about political messages. There's lots of messages that happen in this movie, but specifically political messages. So did you pick up on any messages about power, government, or?
I didn't really pick up on much just outwardly political content personally. You know, there were never any mentions. One that comes off the top of my head is another military movie starring Mark Wahlberg named Lone Survivor. In that movie, there's a scene where they're having to make a hard decision about someone they've just captured behind enemy lines, and they mention the bureaucracy, the steps they would have to take to be able to make that decision legally and not make a war crime.
So some things that I picked up on, similar to your mentioning, I think Lone Survivor was the movie you were talking about, is the mention of Leavenworth. That's very briefly mentioned at the very beginning of the movie, but I got that political message of like very briefly talking about war criminals. And then something interesting about political messages and the lack of them in this movie is that we see their response to 9/11 as far as like the military response, but and the war, but we don't see any government officials. We don't see any like presidential addresses. We don't see any of that. So I thought that was interesting. So, but I think that brings us back to them really wanting to harp on the like PTSD awareness of this movie. I think they didn't want to take away from that by making it politically involved.
Now that you've mentioned that, I don't think in the scene where Taya calls in Chris from another room, she calls him in because she's watching the towers get hit, the Twin Towers get hit on 9/11. And at least it didn't jump out to me. I didn't see if it had a specific name of news network.
Yeah, I don't remember
that could be portrayed closer to one side of the political spectrum. So if it's CNN, which is typically more left-leaning, or a Fox News Network on TV. So I think they did that intentionally. Just showing the footage of the tower so you know what you're talking about, but not any.
There's definitely an unlabeled bottle aspect to that. So bringing it back to our mentioning earlier, this being very focused on conservative values. Some of the values that I wrote down, aspects of the movie that appeal to conservatives. There's very traditional family values, so there's marriage, there's children, there's fidelity within that marriage. There's religion, although it is scarcely mentioned, which we'll touch back on that. But there is religion. He carries a Bible with him. There's traditional gender roles. Also, even overseas, we see the wives or women in general with their children or serving dinner or whatever. And then towards the end of the movie, there's the scene of Chris Kyle going hunting with his son. He has a daughter, but she's not in this scene. She doesn't go hunting with them. And then he also tells his son to look after the women. So very traditional gender roles.
Right.
Lots of patriotism. One could argue that it's pro-gun because of that. Lots of guns. We don't really see any controversy with that. And also something that I said that might be a stretch is that it could be pro-life. We don't really see any mentionings of her struggle with getting pregnant or pregnancy in general. I would say it's pretty pro-life almost. That's not a intentional message, I don't think. It's not a very obvious one.
Right.
And then lastly, I have duty and devotion. He's very devoted and loyal to serving his country, and duty plays a very big role. There are actually quite a few things throughout the film that I picked up on that were pretty liberal. So first and foremost, there's sex and sex before marriage. There's some infidelity. There's alcohol. He frequents the bar. That's where he meets his wife. There's a lot of violence and graphic images, and then there's some mild nudity. So his wife walks in, she's wearing the lingerie.
Yep.
Definitely is more of a liberal appeal. There's explicit language, lots of cussing.
There it is. That's the military for you.
And then something that I thought could kind of be interpreted as a liberal thing is that they sort of de-glorify being in the military. They don't make it some propaganda for joining the military. They really show the harsh realities of being in the military. So I think that can definitely be an appeal of oh hey, they're not just trying to recruit people. They're showing the realities of it.
Right. It's much less of an action montage and more so a call back to reality, like you said.
Yeah. And then talking back about religion, bring that back to that. There is a scarce mentioning of religion, so I think maybe that was intentional. They don't talk about it the whole time. They don't show him going to church. They don't show any of that, but he still makes it apparent that he is religious to some degree.
Right.
So I have that the overarching message of this movie is to bring awareness to the issue of PTSD that veterans and active military members face.
I agree. I think that it was a very nice parallel that they maybe drew unintentionally between the gender roles in a traditional Christian American household and the gender roles specifically for women in both of a Middle Eastern household.
Yeah.
And how similar those two households are for the women, even though they're two polar opposites, and they, for years, a lot of our growing up, saw each other as enemies.
Yeah.
Just outright.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think the whole contrast of showing him back home and how American citizens were seemingly just going about their lives, and there's even that conversation they have in his truck when she's going into labor, where he's kind of talking in the background. She's clearly distracted,
right,
with her labor pains, but he is having this conversation out loud of how everybody here is just living their normal lives while there's a war going on overseas, and he talks about it. So I think it's interesting, the whole contrast. This movie kind of shows them as the enemy, these terrorists as the enemy, but then it also draws these parallels of yes, they are enemies, but they also have very similar things happening. They are wives and sons and husbands and mothers and fathers, and they do live very similar lives a lot of times.
It would say a lot if you, in a lot of ways, it would show a lot of Taya's perspective, but if you looked at what we're talking about right now from the perspective of, if you took this whole movie and told it from Taya's perspective, what's the difference between her life and any of the wives briefly seen in the Middle East? The biggest difference that I can think of, really the only difference between them, is A, how they were raised, how they grew up, and B, that one of their husbands is the invading force in this situation, and the other husband is just protecting his family and his home, essentially.
Right.
So when you look at it from the opposite perspective, what's the difference? They grow up or they are living in such similar environments.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much
Thank you.
for this conversation. I loved being able to break this down and hear your
Absolutely.
perspectives. I thought it was interesting that we could share a lot of the same takes on this movie. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again sometime.
Absolutely.